If you're trying to figure out which one's correct, you should first look at what are the differences between the two equations. And the difference is that here we have 1x and here we have 2x. So the difference between those two things are the frequencies. Whoops. In order to figure out which one has the correct frequency, you got to look at the graph. But remember, the frequency is how many cycles from 0 to 2 pi. So we can't determine the frequency by looking at this graph instantly because the graph doesn't have 2 pi on it. Instead, what we can find is the period, and the period is one full cycle. So one full cycle of the sine curve goes down and it comes up. Remember, a period is every other midpoint. Well, point on the midline. So you would skip the middle one and then go to the opposite. So every 2 points on the midline is your period. This is one cycle. And that one cycle takes you pi units. So our period is pi. Now we know that our frequency is equivalent to 2 pi over your period, which means that your frequency is 2 pi over pi, which is 2. So that makes sense because if one cycle happens from 0 to pi, your frequency, how many cycles happen from 0 to 2 pi, if 1 is pi, then that means 2 cycles are within 2 pi. So anyway, we figured out that the frequency is 2, so clearly Jenna's correct. So I said that Jen is correct because the frequency is 2, and I showed the backup for that work by doing the formula. So example 1 was 2 points on an algebra 2 regions. Now, really specifically, they want you to graph one cycle of a cosine function. We have that because it's cosine, it's going to start at the max if positive or the minimum if negative. We also have that your amplitude is 3, your period is pi over 2, and your midline is y equals -1. If you want to graph this, you have to figure out your max and your minimum. So if you are starting at -1 and you are going up by 3, the amplitude, that means your maximum is 2. If you are starting at the midline and you are going down by your amplitude, that means your minimum is going to be -4. Keep in mind we also need the quarter points in order to help us graph. We don't need the frequency because usually we need the frequency to find the period, but they already gave us the period in this problem. So our quarter points are your period divided by 4, which would be pi over 2 over 4. And again, if you want to do this in your calculator, you would do 1 over 2 divided by 4. Remember, you don't put pi in the calculator. And that is going to give you a value, and you would just put pi back in it. It's actually going to give you 1 over 8, which means that when you put pi back in it, it's going to give you pi over 8. If you want to do it by hand, pi divided by 2 divided by 4, you keep the first fraction, change it to multiplication, flip the second fraction, and then you multiply, and you're still going to get pi over 8. So our first quarter point is pi over 8, then 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, and 4 pi over 8. Now we're going to actually go and graph this. And remember, it says one cycle, so I'm going to spread out my quarter points nice so that I split everything up. I'm going to count every 2. So I have pi over 8, and so on. And then the 3 values I want to pay attention to are my maximum, my midline, and my minimum. So maximum is here. My midline is at -1, and my minimum is at -4. Don't forget to draw a dashed line through your midline. That way it helps us as a reference. There we go. Now, we still don't know whether we're supposed to start at the maximum or the minimum because they didn't tell us if this was a positive or negative cosine curve. And if they didn't give you enough information, you are allowed to choose whether you want to make it positive or negative. However, they did tell you you're starting at 0, 2. And 0, 2 happens to be our maximum value. So this must be a positive cosine curve. They're either going to tell you if it's positive or negative, or they're going to give you a point on the graph that's going to indicate whether it's positive or negative. If they don't do either of those, you get to choose. But I haven't seen a question like that, at least not yet. So remember, cosine curves look like a valley. So because we're already at the maximum, we're now going to go to our midline. And be careful, the midline's not at the x-axis. The midline is at y equals -1. You're on your way down, so the next midline, the next point is going to be on the quarter point at the minimum. And we just went top, middle, bottom, so now we're going to go bottom, middle, top. We're going to work our way back up at the next quarter point on the midline, and your final quarter point is going to end at the maximum. And then you just have to fill it in. Remember, you do not want to keep on going because the problem did say 1 cycle only, and if you did more than 1 cycle, you would lose points. Let's try a different regions question. They want us to graph t of x equals 3 sine of 2x plus 2 over the domain. Now, because they're giving us a very specific domain, we have to take up the entire graph from 0 to 2 pi, regardless of if it's more or less than 1 cycle. We're going to keep going, and we're not going to stop until we get to 2 pi. We're going to do the same exact information, just like before, actually rather yesterday, and we need a midline, an amplitude, a maximum, and a minimum. So our midline here is what you're adding on to the equation. That would be y equals 2. So this graph is shifted 2 units up in the air. Your amplitude would be 3. If you are starting at 2 and you are going up by 3, that means your maximum is 5. If you are starting at 2 and going down by 3, your minimum is -1. So we're going to take these values and we are going to put them on your y-axis. We have 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have -1, and we have 2. And again, put your reference through your midline. There we go. Now you want to find your x-axis values, so you're going to identify what your period is. And before you figure out your period, you need your frequency, because your frequency is found in the equation, not your period. So the frequency is found in front of the variable, which is 2. That means your period has the formula 2 pi over your frequency, which would be 2 pi over 2, which would be pi. So keep in mind we're supposed to go from 0 to 2 pi, but one cycle is pi. So if we're supposed to continue, that means we're going to have 2 cycles, which makes sense because the frequency is 2 from 0 to 2 pi. Anyway, your quarter points would be your period over 4. So if you take pi and you divide by 4, that's your period. Your first quarter point is pi over 4. Next is 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4. Now this represents one cycle because it is 4 quarter points. However, we're not supposed to end here because 4 pi over 4 is pi. We're supposed to end at 2 pi. So I'm going to keep on going with my quarter points. That means I'm just going to keep on counting upwards. 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, and 8 pi over 4. Now, 8 divided by 4 is 2. So I finally ended where I'm supposed to given my domain. And now that I made another 4 quarter points, that would be a whole other cycle. Now, you didn't have to complete the second cycle. Like, let's say 2 pi was only like 2 quarter points. That wouldn't be a full cycle. It would be half of a full cycle, and that's okay. You don't have to always graph one full cycle of sine or cosine. You just graph however much, is needed until you get to the domain. Anyway, I'm going to go and list out all of my quarter points. And I want to make sure I keep all 8 on the graph. So let's see if all 8 will fit if I count every 2 boxes. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, it fits. Make sure you don't count every 3 boxes because if you do go off of this graph, if you don't fit 2 pi up on the axis they give you, you lose a point. You cannot extend the graph on your own. So I've listed all my quarter points, and now I'm going to start graphing. This is a positive sine curve. So positive sine starts at the midline, and because it's positive, it's going to go upwards. In other words, we're making something that looks like this. So I'm starting at my midline, and at my next quarter point, I'm going to go up to my maximum value. Once you hit the max, you're going to come back down to the middle, and you're going to work on going towards your minimum. And then you're going to come back up. Now this was one cycle from 0 to pi. But again, I'm going to keep going until I get to 2 pi. So I'm going to restart the whole process. I'm going to go back up to my maximum, come back down to my middle, and then I'm going to work on hitting the minimum. And I'm going to end at the middle again. And I'm going to connect it. But better than that. There we go. And you're done. Let's look at the next one. So this would be worth another 2 points, as was the last one, even though that was a lot of work for 2 points. This case, they want you to graph 2 cycles. So they're not giving you a domain, but they are telling you how many cycles to actually graph. They're giving us a cosine function, And if it's a cosine function, it either starts at the maximum if it's positive or the minimum if it's negative. We know that your amplitude is 4, your period is 2 pi, and your midline is y equals 1. So if we are looking for your maximum and your minimum, if you're starting at 1 and you're going up by 4, that's going to bring you to 5. If you're starting at 1 and you are going down by 4, that's going to bring you to -3. Yeah, that looks right. So I'm going to put my midline at 1, my maximum of 5, and my minimum of -3. I'm going to look at my graph and I'm going to see that it makes sense because there's 4 units here and there's 4 spaces here, which is the amplitude, and they're equal. So that's good. I have the right values. I'm also going to go and put down my midline as a reference. Next, I'm going to look for my x-axis values. So I have my period and I have my quarter points. To get your quarter points, you're going to take the period and divide by 4. So 2 pi over 4 simplifies to pi over 2 because 2 divided by 4 is a half. From there, your first quarter point is pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. Those are 4 quarter points, so this is 1 cycle. But the question is asking for 2 cycles, so I'm going to do another 4. That's going to be 5 pi over 4, over 2, 6 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2, and 8 pi over 2, which is another 2 cycles. Sorry, it is another cycle, which would bring it to 2 cycles. Keep in mind, you don't have to simplify your quarter points if you don't want to. My suggestion is to just leave it as is. Why bother if you don't have to do it? And you're going to space your quarter points out nicely on the graph. If you need to, pause the video, write down the quarter points, and then come back to it. Now, the question is telling you that you're passing through the point 0, -5, so you should put that on the graph, except 0, -5 doesn't make sense. So that must be a bad question. I would imagine that the problem meant to say -3. Yeah, let's go with 0, -3, because that actually makes sense. So with 0, -3, that's going to be your minimum. And that means we're having a negative cosine function. So we're starting at the minimum, so the graph is going to look like a hill. We're starting at the bottom, and we're going to work our way to the top by going to the midline. And you see what I just did? I put a green dot on the x-axis. That's why I want you guys to draw your midline, because I realized immediately that I messed up because that dot is not on my dash line. It's not to the x-axis, it's to the midline. And the midline is at 1. We're going to work our way to the top. And then we are going to turn around and come back down. And end at the bottom. This would be 1 cosine curve, except let's pretend that I actually drew that in nicely. Yeah, no, it's not getting better than that. So that was 1 cycle, but the question said to do 2 cycles, so I'm going to repeat the process. I'm already at the bottom. So I'm going to go back to my midline. I'm going to work my way to the top, turn around and come back to the middle, and I'm going to end going back down to the bottom. And there you have it. 2 cycles of the cosine function with the given parameters. Please make sure that you actually have all of those dots on the graph. If you don't have these main dots at the minimums, middles, and maximums, you are not going to get full credit even if your graph looks perfect and is drawn in all the right spaces. It has to have the coordinates to show you know where you plotted it. Because this video is starting to take a while, I'm going to skip example 4a and b, and we're going to finish up by graphing c. So, they want you to graph this equation on the given domain. That means we need to find our basic information, our midline, our amplitude, your maximum, your minimum, your frequency, which is going to give us our period to find our quarter points. Remember, you do have to remember all these values and you need to show them as part of your work. So your midline is what you're adding or subtracting onto the equation. And in this case, you are not adding or subtracting anything. So your midline is the x-axis. It's plus 0. Just make sure you write y equals 0. Your amplitude is what's in front of the trig equation, which in this case is a1, not -1, because an amplitude is a distance and it's always positive. If you are starting at 0 and you are going up by 1, that means your maximum is going to be 1. On the flip side, if you're starting at 0 and you're going down by 1, your minimum is going to be -1. Your frequency is found in front of the variable, which would be 2. And that means your period is going to be 2 pi over your frequency. So 2 pi over 2, which is pi. So if you want to find your quarter points, you take the period and you divide by 4. Your period is pi. We're dividing by 4, not 2. And that's going to be your first quarter point. So we have pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. This would be 1 cycle. But this is also pi, because 4 divided by 4 is 1. And they're asking us to go to 2 pi. So I'm going to continue until I get to 2 pi. 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 8 pi over 4. And 8 divided by 4 is 2. So I finally got to my domain of 2 pi. And that would be my second cycle because it's another 4 quarter points. Every 4 quarter points is a new cycle. I'm going to take this information and I'm going to put it on my graph. And after you work to do all of that, it's probably a good time to tell you that you really don't need to label all of your quarter points. You just need to label your first quarter point, which is pi over 4, and your last one, which is 8 pi over 4. You could just make a tick marks in between and leave the others blank. But I like to write them in because it helps me know which one I'm on. From there, you also need your midline, maximum, and minimum. Now, if I did 1, 0, and -1, this graph is going to be super tiny. So instead, I'm going to spread everything out. I'm going to count up by 4 to get to 1, and down by 4 to get to -1, because I feel like it. You could count up by 3, you could count up by 8. I don't care. Just make sure however many boxes you put up for 1 is how many boxes you go down for -1. They need to be equidistant. And our midline has the reference at the x-axis. A little bit easier for this one, kind of hard to see because I did it in purple. Probably would have been easier if I did it in a different color. There we go. Now, this is a negative sine curve. So that means you start at the midline, and because it's negative, you are going to go downwards. We're going to start down first and then go up. So I'm starting at my midline, which is at 0, and I'm going to go down to my minimum value. You're going to come back up to your midline, go up to your maximum, and come back down to your midline. That right there is 1 cycle. There we go. Now, they did ask you to go until 2 pi, so I'm going to continue on with life and repeat the process. I'm already at the midline, so I'm going to head downwards to the minimum. Come back up to your midline, go up to the maximum, and you're going to end back at the midline where you started. And you're just going to connect it better than I did. But that would be your graph from 0 to 2 pi, which happens to be 2 cycles. Here is your first cycle. And there's your second cycle. And that's it. Tomorrow we're going to work on more word problems given by the regions.